In this war, 4 million Filipinos bravely fought against the world's most powerful military, and they almost won. But today, very few people know about this war or the sacrifices made by these brave Filipinos. So today, we will look at this forgotten war between the Filipinos and the Americans and how it led to the rise of one of the biggest superpowers in the world. The year is 1898, and the Spanish Empire has just lost a war. No, not the Spanish Civil War, but the Spanish-American War. In fact, this war was fought over 2 different islands, Cuba and the Philippines. The US wanted Cuba and Spain had the Philippines. So they went to war, and the Spanish lost. They lost mainly because they didn't have the resources to fight both the Americans over here and the Cubans over here. So after winning this war, the Americans now controlled 2 new territories, but they didn't expect what would happen next. You see, before the war, the Filipinos had been under Spanish rule for more than 300 years, and during all that time, they never once rebelled. But after seeing what the Americans were like, they decided enough was enough. They wanted independence from both the Spaniards and the Americans. Now, this may seem confusing, but let me explain. Before the war, the Filipinos were ruled by the Spanish, but many of them had actually grown to like the Spanish. I mean, they had been there for so long that they were basically family. On the other hand, the Filipinos hated the Americans because they were outsiders. Many of them actually thought that the Americans were evil and had come to their island to steal gold. That's why when the Spanish left, they immediately attacked the Americans. The Americans were completely caught off guard. They had no idea that the Filipinos wanted independence. And when they realized it, it was too late. The Filipinos had already attacked them. This is what started the Philippine-American War. Now, you may think that this war must have been really quick because the Americans were much stronger than the Filipinos, but you would be wrong. This war lasted for 4 years, from 1899 to 1902, and it was one of the most costly wars in American history. It was so bad that President Teddy Roosevelt once said that he would trade all of Alaska just to get rid of the Filipino problem. In fact, the Filipinos almost won this war. They managed to defeat the Americans in more than 70 major battles and over 2,000 minor ones. Their best victory was at the Battle of Tirod Pass in 1899. At the time, the Filipino army had around 750 soldiers, while the American army had nearly 6,000. But despite being outnumbered, the Filipinos won. They defeated the Americans and sent them running away. Their leader was a man named General Luna, one of the greatest generals in Filipino history. He was known for his bravery and skill in battle, but he wasn't perfect. In fact, he was often arrogant and hot-headed. And because of that, he had many enemies, especially one, President Aguinaldo. You see, Aguinaldo was the president of the Philippines at the time, and even though he was a good leader, he wasn't a good judge of character. He put Luna in charge of the Northern Luzon campaign, which was one of the most important parts of the war, but soon after, he started getting reports that Luna was acting strangely. He was going on the offensive way too much and wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. Aguinaldo was worried that the Filipino forces would eventually run out of supplies. So he ordered Luna to stop attacking and instead focus on defense. But Luna refused to listen. He continued to attack the Americans, and soon after he paid the price. While fighting the Americans, he got killed. Some say he was shot by an American sniper, while others say it was a Filipino sniper. Either way, he was dead, and with him the Filipino army lost its greatest general. But even without Luna, the Filipinos continued to fight. They kept attacking the Americans for 2 more years. But, as time passed by, they had less and less success. The Americans were better organized and had way more supplies. The Filipinos simply couldn't match up. And then, in 1902, it all ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth. The Filipinos had hoped to get full independence, but that wasn't possible. The Americans weren't ready to let go of the Philippines yet. Instead, the Americans gave them limited self-rule and promised that someday in the future they would get independence. As for the Filipinos who had fought in the war, they were given citizenship and the right to vote. But that still wasn't enough for some Filipinos, like General MacArthur. He had been fighting the Americans since 1899, and now he was being told to lay down his arms. He was furious and didn't want to accept the treaty, but he knew it was pointless. He might be the greatest general in Filipino history, but he couldn't win against the Americans, so he did something even greater. He surrendered. His surrender led to the end of the war and the start of a new chapter in Philippine history. But let's take a step back and look at the Americans. They had won the war, but it hadn't been easy. They had fought for 4 years and had lost thousands of soldiers. In fact, more American soldiers died in the Philippines than in the Spanish-American War. Many people back home started asking why they had even gone to war in the first place. But despite all the losses, the war had been worth it. The Americans had gained control of one of the most important islands in Asia. They had also built a strong military base there, which they used to control the Pacific Ocean. In fact, from the Philippines, they could easily spy on the Chinese and Japanese. They could also block China's plan to expand into Southeast Asia and Japan's plan to invade the United States. Because of that, the Philippine-American War was one of the most important wars in American history. It marked the beginning of the United States as a world power and the decline of Spain as a world power. In fact, the only reason why Spain had lost all of its colonies was because the Americans had cut them a deal. They agreed to give Spain $20 million if it gave up its colonies in Asia and the Caribbean, and that's exactly what Spain did. With that money, it was able to keep hold of its colony in Africa, which it held on to until 1975. As for the Philippines, it would be 50 years before they got their independence. That's because after World War II, the Americans realized that the Philippines were strategically important. They were right in the middle of the Pacific, and the Americans needed somewhere to rest and refuel during the war. That's why they helped the Filipinos rebuild their country after the war. In return, they asked for permission to build military bases there. The Filipinos agreed, and the Americans built the largest military bases they had ever built. These bases were so important that the Americans stationed 100,000 soldiers there. In fact, these bases remained in American hands until 1992, 45 years after the Philippine-American War had ended. Today, the memory of this war lives on in the hearts of every Filipino. Every year they remember the brave men and women who fought for their country. They remember the soldiers who marched across mountains and rivers. They remember the medics who saved lives on the battlefield. And they remember the civilians who helped the war effort in any way they could. They also remember the leaders of the war, men like President Aguinaldo and General Luna. They are remembered as heroes who fought for freedom and independence. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that the Filipino people never gave up. They kept fighting even when the odds were stacked against them. They never gave up even when they were outgunned and outnumbered. They never gave up even when their best general was killed. And they didn't have to because, in the end, they won. Sure, they didn't get the full independence they had hoped for, but they still won. They won because they never lost hope. They kept fighting for what they believed in, and in the end, they won. Now, if you want to learn more about the Filipinos and their amazing culture, I highly recommend watching the video on the largest floating restaurant in the world. You will get to learn about the Filipino love for food, and you will see the world's largest restaurant. Now, before I end this video, I would like to thank our supporters for their support. We wouldn't be able to make videos like this without their help.